I'm 66 years old now, and I've been hiding the biggest secret of my life. The desert around me hums with the same sound it did when I was a boy, the wind against the cliffs, the sigh of distant coyotes, and that strange low thrum that lives in the canyons long after sundown. Tonight, the sky burns orange over the sandstone, and I can smell rain far off in the west. It takes me back to the summer of 1962, when I first learned that the old stories weren't stories at all. My grandfather, Ben Nez, was a quiet man, the kind whose silence carried more weight than sermons. His hair was long and gray even then, tied with a leather cord that smelled of smoke and juniper. I was 10, all elbows and curiosity, trailing after him with a hurting stick I could barely lift. The sheep moved slow across the mesa, and I remember thinking how the land felt alive, like something ancient was listening to every footstep we took. We camped by the canyon rim that night, near a bend in the river where the cliffs glowed like embers after sunset. The fire was small, and my grandfather said little, only murmuring old words in Navajo, prayers to the wind, to the stone, to the things that lived unseen. I didn't understand them then. I only remember how his voice dropped low, how his eyes shifted toward the dark beyond the flames, as though he were waiting for someone, or something, to answer. When the first crack came from the brush, I thought it was a deer. But the second sound was different, heavier, more deliberate, like footsteps testing the earth. My grandfather raised his hand, and the world seemed to stop breathing. I could hear my own heart hammering in the quiet. Then, through the slant of moonlight, a figure stepped out. It stood taller than any man I had ever seen, broad as a doorway, its fur the color of wet earth. The firelight caught its eyes, and they shone like river stones in shallow water, reflective, steady, not cruel. My grandfather didn't move. He reached into his pack, took out a small pouch of cornmeal and whispered, "Neatsai, old forest brother." The creature blinked once, twice, and I swear to the spirits it understood. It made a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a word, and then turned and vanished into the canyon shadows. We sat there long after it was gone. My grandfather finally spoke, voice thin with age. "You saw what you saw. Tell no one. Not your mother. Not the schoolteacher. Some things don't belong to the white man's world." He pressed the cornmeal pouch into my hands. "You'll know when to use it." That night I couldn't sleep. The wind moaned through the junipers like someone crying far away. I kept seeing those eyes, that impossible shape, and wondered why it hadn't hurt us. Fear mingled with wonder until I couldn't tell them apart. When dawn came, the fire was ash and the ground was covered in tracks, bare feet, human-like but longer, deeper. My grandfather wiped them away with a cedar branch before the sun could see. The following weeks felt strange. The canyon seemed to watch us now. Birds went quiet when we passed, and sometimes, while tending the sheep, I'd feel something standing just beyond the edge of my vision. My grandfather didn't seem afraid, but he grew more guarded, whispering prayers even when the day was bright. Once I asked him if it would come back. He just looked at me with those smoke-colored eyes and said, "The ones who live between worlds return when they're needed." By autumn, the air had cooled and the wind carried dust like whispers. My grandfather fell ill, nothing sudden, just the slow unraveling that comes to old men. He stayed inside our hogan, coughing soft into his blanket, leaving me to tend the animals alone. I remember one evening walking back from the pen, when the sky turned the color of copper and the first cold rain began to fall. The sheep were restless. Something was moving beyond the fence line, something big. I froze. Through the rain a shape emerged. It stood where the canyon met the field, half shrouded in mist. My hands trembled, the cornmeal pouch still in my pocket. Without thinking, I took a pinch and scattered it on the ground. The figure didn't advance. It lowered its head as if acknowledging the gesture, and then faded back into the storm. When I told my grandfather, he smiled weakly. "It's watching over you," he said. "You have its respect now." That was the last real conversation we had before he passed that winter. I buried him near the river bend, where the stones are warm even in December. The day after the burial, I found footprints in the mud beside his grave, two large, one small, as though a child had stood beside the giant. Years went by. The world changed. The government built new roads through our lands, cutting deep scars into sacred earth. Men with cameras and rifles came, calling themselves researchers. They asked about strange tracks, broken branches, noises in the night. I said nothing. The memory of that creature had rooted itself deep inside me, twined with my grandfather's voice, his warnings, his faith. But the silence was heavy. It pressed on me with each passing year. Sometimes I'd dream of the canyon glowing blue under moonlight, of eyes watching from the cliffs. Sometimes I'd wake with the feeling that something ancient still guarded us, unseen but near. The sheep would stir in the night, and I'd hear distant breathing, steady, patient, familiar. One evening, maybe a decade after my grandfather's death, I was walking the lower trail alone when I found something half buried beneath a cedar tree. A small carving, shaped crudely from river stone, a man and a taller figure standing side by side. I didn't make it. No one in our family carved like that. The edges were weathered smooth by time. I took it home and set it near the hearth, but every time I looked at it, my chest tightened with that old mix of fear and awe. Over time, I stopped questioning what was real. The desert teaches you that truth and legend are not enemies, they share the same skin. I lived, married, raised children, but I never told them what I'd seen. The world beyond our mesas doesn't forgive mystery, it dissects it. Still, sometimes, when the wind blows from the north and carries the smell of pine and rain, I feel eyes on me again. Not threatening. Watching. Waiting. Last summer, while helping my grandson gather wood near the old grazing field, he stopped suddenly and pointed toward the ridge. "Grandpa," he whispered, "someone's up there." I followed his gaze, and for a heartbeat I saw it too, a silhouette against the setting sun, massive, still, unmistakable. My throat went dry. By the time I blinked, it was gone. That night, as the fire crackled low, I told the boy an old story about guardians of the land, beings who walked between our world and the spirits. He listened wide-eyed, never guessing how much of it was memory. When he fell asleep, I stepped outside and felt that same wind from long ago, carrying the scent of sage and wet stone. Somewhere far off, an echo rose through the canyon, low and mournful, like the breath of a giant beneath the earth. I stood there until my bones ached with cold, listening to that sound fade into the night. And just before it vanished completely, I thought I heard it again, a voice, deep and rough, whispering my name the way only one other being ever had. And that was the moment I realized the silence of the canyons was never empty at all. It was him, waiting for me to remember. The winter of 1978 came down on the mesas like a curse. By November, the wind had turned sharp as flint, and every night carried the howl of something old moving through the canyons. The sky itself felt bruised, heavy with snow that refused to fall. I was 26 then, my grandfather long buried, my mother fading into quiet prayers. I lived alone in the hogan by the edge of the red cliffs, tending sheep, mending fences, and listening to the emptiness that stretched wider with every sunset. The cold that year was cruel, colder than anything I'd felt before. Water froze inside the buckets before I could carry them home. Coyotes went silent. Even the ravens vanished. Sometimes at dusk, I'd stand by the corral and stare out toward the canyon where I'd seen him as a boy, where the memory of those eyes still lived. The snow lay thick across the valley floor, untouched by tracks. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. One night, while the wind clawed at the roof, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in years, a deep, rhythmic breathing beyond the walls. Slow, patient, close. I grabbed my rifle out of habit, though I knew it wouldn't matter against what I thought was out there. I opened the door, and the night spilled in like a living thing. The snow caught the firelight, and through it I saw two shapes. One tall and broad-shouldered, the other smaller, barely up to its chest. Both stood still, their breath fogging the air. The taller one leaned against a boulder, its leg dragging slightly. The smaller clung to its side. I should have been afraid. Instead, I felt the weight of recognition settle in my chest like a forgotten prayer. My hands moved on their own. I reached for the pot beside the fire, a stew of venison and corn, and carried it into the cold. The figures didn't move until I set it down on the snow between us. The smaller one stepped forward first. I caught the glint of its eyes, amber, bright as candle flame. It sniffed the air, then looked back to the larger one. The tall figure knelt, wincing, its breath catching with pain. That was when I saw the blood, dark against the snow, thick and heavy near its thigh. I didn't speak. Words felt like insults in that silence. I just pointed toward the warmth of the hogan, hoping they would understand. The smaller one tilted its head, mimicking the gesture. Then slowly they turned and vanished into the treeline. I stood there long after they were gone, the pot steaming, untouched. When I came back in, the stew's smell had turned cold. I left it by the doorway just in case. By morning, the pot was empty, licked clean. Beside it lay 3 pine cones stacked neatly, their tips dusted with snow. The gesture was deliberate. Betrayed. Thank you. I felt my throat tighten. Over the next week they returned. Always at night, always silent. Sometimes, when I left food, I'd find strange things left behind. Smooth river stones carved with lines, bundles of cedar bark tied with sinew, once even a tuft of fur the size of my hand, warm as a heartbeat. I began speaking softly when I left the food, half prayers, half conversations. For your strength, I'd say. For your little one. The wind carried my words, and somewhere out there I imagined they were heard. Then came the night when he spoke back. It was deep winter, the kind where even fire couldn't fight the cold. The moon hung white and distant, and snow hissed softly against the ground. I was mending a broken latch by the doorway when I heard the sound again, that slow breathing, closer now. When I turned, the tall one stood no more than 10 paces away, his shadow stretching across the snow like a mountain's ghost. The smaller one was gone. He stepped forward, limping, eyes fixed on me. His fur was streaked with frost, his chest rising and falling in labored rhythm. He reached toward the pot beside the door, then paused. His lips moved. At first it was only a rough rumble, a growl shaped like sound. But then a word. Broken. Halting. Tusima. It wasn't my full name, but close enough that my blood froze. The voice was deep, like stones rolling under a river. I wanted to fall to my knees. He knew me. Somehow, across years and storms, he had remembered. I whispered his name, though I'd never had one for him. Nitsai, I said, the word my grandfather had used. His eyes softened. The air between us felt alive, vibrating with something neither human nor beast. He moved closer until I could see the scars beneath his fur, the wound in his leg crudely bound with woven grass and bark. I reached for the medicine bundle near the door, my hands trembling. I set it down slowly, never breaking eye contact. He studied me for a long moment, then lowered himself onto one knee. The earth shook under his weight. I cleaned the wound, my fingers numb with both cold and disbelief. He didn't flinch, only watched. When I tied the final knot, he exhaled, a deep, weary sigh, and looked toward the horizon as though listening to something I couldn't hear. That night, I sat by the fire, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes again, heard that voice dragging my name from its depths. It felt like the canyon itself had spoken. Over the following weeks, the visits grew more frequent. Sometimes he'd appear at the treeline, other times I'd find his tracks circling the corral as though guarding it. The smaller one often followed, darting between trees, curious and shy. I began leaving extra meat for them both. As winter deepened, so did our unspoken understanding. One night, when the wind roared through the ravine, I saw him standing there against the gale, shoulders squared, facing the storm as if daring it to pass. I don't know why, but I felt safer knowing he was near. When the blizzard broke 3 days later, I found the sheep unharmed, their tracks circled by much larger ones that led off into the canyon. Protection. He kept watch. In the quiet days that followed, I began to wonder what he thought of me. Did he see me as kin or just another creature of this land he guarded? I started carving small gifts from wood, shapes of animals, of spirits, of things my grandfather once taught me to honor. I left them by the old river bend where the canyon narrows. Each time they disappeared by morning. Once in their place I found a single feather, gray, massive, unlike any bird I'd ever seen. Then one evening, late February, I followed his tracks farther than I ever had before. The trail wound deep into the canyons where the cliffs swallowed sound. I came to a clearing under a towering juniper. There, half hidden beneath fallen branches, was a shelter, woven from sticks, bones, and hides. The air smelled of smoke and pine. I knew it was his. I should have turned back, but curiosity rooted me. Hanging from one branch was the same kind of carving I'd found years ago. 2 figures, one man, one giant, standing side by side. Only this one had something new, between them a smaller shape, child-sized. The realization struck me like thunder. The smaller one was his offspring. He wasn't just surviving out here, he was teaching, protecting, passing on. Just as my grandfather had done for me. For the first time in my life I felt I understood him, not as a creature of legend but as a father. I left quietly, leaving a pouch of dried corn and the feather he had given me, as an offering of respect. That night, the canyon was alive with sound again, low rumbles, almost like laughter carried on the wind. It echoed between the cliffs until the stars themselves seemed to tremble. But peace never lasts long on this land. The thaw came early that year, and with it strangers, surveyors, men with trucks and radios. They spoke of wildlife tracking and thermal imaging. I watched them set up their equipment at the canyon mouth, their machines humming where once there was only silence. I prayed they would find nothing. Yet deep down I knew their eyes were sharper than before. The last time I saw him, the sky was bleeding orange through the clouds. He stood on the ridge, the smaller one at his side. He looked back only once, as if memorizing the shape of me, the smell of smoke from my fire. I wanted to call out, to warn him, to beg him to hide, but the wind took my words. Then they were gone, swallowed by the forest. That night I couldn't sleep. The radio crackled with distant voices. One word kept repeating through the static: contact. And when the sound cut out, the silence that followed felt heavier than snow, heavier than truth itself. The world changed quietly after that winter. Roads crawled deeper into the mesas, telephone wires sliced the open sky, and the old songs of the canyons fell silent beneath the hum of machines. I aged without noticing it, the way the red rock erodes one grain at a time. My hair silvered, my hands grew stiff, and yet every evening I still walked to the edge of the cliffs, looking for a shadow that no longer came. The world called what I saw a myth, but I carried it like a wound that never closed. His voice, rough and heavy as stone, still echoed in my dreams. Sometimes I woke thinking I'd heard it whisper my name through the wind. By the early 80s, men with government badges started showing up more often. They came in white trucks with antennas and cameras, asking about forest anomalies and unidentified wildlife. They claimed they were studying migration patterns, but I knew better. I'd see the way they scanned the ground, the way they whispered when they found a footprint half filled with rain. They called them samples. I called them graves waiting to happen. Each night, I prayed they wouldn't find him or the young one. I moved my herd farther north, closer to the sacred springs where the land was rougher, harder to reach. But the silence followed me there too clean, too deliberate. Once at dawn, I found a tree split clean in half, as if lightning had struck it from the inside. I ran my hand along the splintered bark and found something caught there, a strand of coarse, dark hair. I buried it in the sand. It felt like hiding a piece of him. Years slipped by in that uneasy peace. Then came the spring of 1991 when my mother began to fade. She was the last of the old ones, her breath a whisper of cedar smoke and prayer. Every day I walked to the spring to offer tobacco and ask for her healing, though I knew death had already taken her name. That morning the air was thick with fog, the kind that moves like spirits between trees. I was kneeling by the water when I felt it, the same pressure I'd known since childhood, that weight of being watched by something vast and ancient. I turned and there he was. He was older now, grayer around the shoulders, his once black fur streaked with silver. The scars on his leg had thickened into pale ropes. He stood taller than I remembered, though time had bowed him too. For a moment, neither of us moved. The fog curled around him like breath. When I stepped closer, he didn't retreat. His eyes were the same, amber, human, infinite. I saw recognition there, not of my face but of the years between us, of what we had both lost to silence. He raised his hand, palm outward, slow and deliberate. I mirrored the gesture. The world around us stilled, no birds, no wind, only the heartbeat in my ears. He reached into the leather pouch that hung across his chest and drew something out, a small bone flute carved with care, smoothed by time. He held it to his chest, then placed it gently in the snow at my feet. I picked it up, the bone warm as living flesh. When I looked back up, he was gone. That night I played it. The sound was haunting, hollow and pure, like wind caught inside a cave. But beneath it there was something else, an answering tone, faint and distant, echoing from deep within the canyon. It rose, lingered, then faded like a sigh. It wasn't music. It was communication. A goodbye. I never saw him again. 2 years later the storms came. Rain fell without mercy for 9 days. The river swelled, tearing at its banks, carrying trees and boulders like toys. When it finally eased, the land looked rearranged, ribs of rock exposed, gullies carved where none had been. I went to check the spring, fearing it might have vanished under the flood. Instead I found something else. Near the bend where I'd last seen him, the earth had collapsed, opening a shallow cave. Inside, half buried in mud and stone, lay bones. Enormous bones. A ribcage that could have sheltered a child, arms long as fence posts. They weren't human, not exactly, but not animal either. Beside them, the remnants of woven grass, shaped into what might once have been a bed. The air was thick with decay, yet sacred somehow, as if time itself had been kneeling there in grief. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I just sat in the mud, hands shaking, and whispered, "Rest easy, brother." Then I began to bury him again. Stone by stone I sealed the cave. Each rock felt heavier than the last, pressing the secret deeper into the earth where it belonged. I built a cairn of cedar and red shale above it, the same way our people mark the graves of those who must never be disturbed. When I finished, the rain started again, soft this time, almost like a blessing. Word spread weeks later of strange findings near the canyon. The men with badges returned, carrying shovels and scanners, combing the area. They stopped at my homestead, asking if I'd seen anything washed up by the floods. I met their eyes and said no. They didn't believe me. They left with polite smiles, promising to return. That night, I sat by the fire and held the flute. My hands were steady now. I played until the stars blurred, until the desert itself seemed to hum along. Years passed. My mother died and the old songs were buried with her. My children moved to cities, traded prayers for paychecks, and I didn't blame them. The world had no room for watchers anymore. But I stayed. The canyon still called to me in dreams, the low hum of wind through stone, the whisper of footsteps where there should be none. Some nights I'd wake to find the fire dying low and the door ajar, cold air rolling in. Once I thought I saw a shadow move beyond the flames, broad, slow, familiar, but I no longer chased ghosts. Now I am old, the kind of old that makes every sunrise feel like borrowed time. My grandchildren visit sometimes. They ask why I never leave this place. I tell them the truth, because there are spirits here that still remember me. When the nights turn cold and the stars are bright, I sit outside with the flute and play, soft and low. Sometimes I hear an echo, just a faint answering tone carried on the wind. Maybe it's only memory. Maybe not. But I've kept the secret all these years because love demands silence as much as it demands truth. The government, the scientists, they search for evidence, for proof. But what they're really hunting is wonder, and wonder dies when you put it under glass. I couldn't let that happen to him. He was never a monster. He was a guardian, a father, a reflection of everything good this land still hides. A few winters ago, I went back to the canyon one last time. The cairn was still there, untouched, the stones bleached white by sun and time. I laid the flute atop it and whispered the words my grandfather once taught me, "Walk in beauty." Then I turned to leave. But before I reached the ridge, the wind rose suddenly, swirling dust around my feet. It carried a sound, deep, low, familiar. Not the flute, not the wind. A voice. My name, stretched thin across the distance, fading into the echoes. I stood there until my legs trembled, staring into that vast red horizon. And for the first time in decades I felt no fear, no sorrow, only gratitude. Because I knew beyond doubt that some part of him still walked beneath those stones, watching, waiting, listening. If anyone ever finds that cairn, I hope they'll understand. I hope they'll leave it be. The world doesn't need another legend dissected, another truth turned into spectacle. Some stories must remain buried, living only in the hearts of those who witnessed them. The sun was setting when I made my way back home, painting the cliffs in the color of blood and rust. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, like a farewell. When I reached the door, I heard it again, the faint, hollow call of the flute, though it lay miles behind me. I smiled, closed my eyes, and whispered into the dusk, "I hear you, old friend." The wind answered with silence, the kind that feels alive. And in that silence, I knew the secret was safe, beneath the stones, beneath the years, beneath me.